Hello, everyone. What you're about to listen to is an old episode of a podcast I used to record called Everyone Loves a Bad Guy. In honor of Ant-Man and the Quantum Mania, whatever the heck it's called, I don't really care. I'll be reviewing it on Damn You Hollywood. But in honor of that show, in that movie coming out, we are re-airing this particular episode of Everyone Loves a Bad Guy that is dedicated to looking at Ant-Man, at Hank Pym, more specifically because that's normally who's Ant-Man in the comics, and his rogues gallery, such as it is. Relatively short episode this week. Hope you all enjoy it. Thank you very, very much as always for tuning in. This episode originally aired July 24th, 2015. So quite a while ago at this point in time. Anywho, that's it. That's the preamble. Short preamble. Throw it back to my past self now. Hope you all enjoy the show.
When the devil is too busy and debt's a bit too much, they call on me by name, you see, for my special touch. To the gentlemen, I'm misfortune. To the ladies, I'm surprise. But call me by any name, anyway, it's all the same. I'm the fly in your suit, I'm the kettle in your shoe, I'm the bee beneath your bed, I'm a bump on every head, I'm the heel on which you slip, I'm a pin in every head, I'm the thorn in your side, makes you wiggle and writhe, and it's so easy when you're evil. This is the life you see, the devil tips his hat to me, I do it all because I'm evil, and I do it all for free. Your tears are all the pay I'll ever need.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages. This is Everyone Loves a Bad Guy. I'm Robert Winfree, and thank you all so very much for being here, for tuning in, for listening, for choosing this particular podcast. I know it's an odd podcast. It doesn't fit into most of the, they have. I bounce all over the place in terms of thematic material. It's a pain to kind of figure out where it goes whenever I put this thing into Blog Talk and okay, what genre does it fit into? All right, it bounces around a little bit. It's a bit of an odd duck, and I am eternally grateful to everyone who tunes in, week after week, whether you're on iTunes, Blog Talk, whether you're live or after the fact. However you came to this show, however you choose to continue listening, I am eternally grateful that you have found this show and that you are listening to this show. It means a lot to me. All the other shows on the network here, they've all got kind of built-in audiences. There's the wrestling show, the movies, the MMA show. There's something for everybody, and it's pretty easy to find. For some reason, mine is I'm the odd one out as far as that goes. I don't fit into a lot of the other kind of neatly prepackaged genres that appeal to people. I cross the board here talking about villains because I talk about villains everywhere. And again, however you found us, I'm very grateful, and I continue to be grateful on all of these shows. All right, tonight I'm actually on my own tonight. I have no guest. It's been an odd week for me, guys. This is all on me, and I have to apologize in advance for this week maybe being not quite up to par with some of my better efforts, because I've had some good ones. I've had some not so good as well. They're learning experiences. I don't think I've had a really bad podcast as far as that goes, but I've had learning experiences. And this week, this week I have not been firing on all cylinders. I don't know what it is. Maybe I'm still a little bit, and from an energy standpoint, from an emotional and intellectual standpoint, I'm still a little burned out from last week when I had a bunch of MMA events to cover. I don't know. That's probably contributing to it. I've just not everything I've done this week, I feel like I've been dragging ass, and I hate that feeling. And it made me, again, I didn't get a co-host lined up in time, and I had two very, talented people on the network, Jesse Starcher and Jason Teasley. Jason offered very early. I didn't get his message early enough. I didn't get back to him in time. And again, this is all on me. There's no blame here except my own. It's on me. And I need to, so again, apologize in advance for that. But I'm here. I'm going to soldier on. I'm going to deliver a podcast. I'm going to learn from the experiences here for this week, and we're going to move on. We're going to get bigger and better next week. That's I'm still again that everything it has to keep improving. All right, because if it gets much worse, I'll have to abandon this altogether. All right, tonight in honor of Marvel's latest cinematic venture, Ant-Man, coming out. It's been kind of Ant-Man week here on the Radulich Broadcasting Network. Jesse Starcher talked about a couple of Ant-Man stories over on Source Material on Monday. Mark Radulich and I reviewed Ant-Man on Wednesday. The Metal Hammer of Doom had nothing to do with Ant-Man, but it's the Metal Hammer of Doom. They're their own little world. And so we come to the end of the week here. And my plan was always when Ant-Man came out to talk about, the character Ant-Man, a bit of the source material, his rogues gallery as such, because that's kind of what I do when these major characters come out. If I haven't already covered them, I give them a, pretty thorough once over. If I've already covered it, I don't mind going back and redoing it. That's not much of a problem here. But I got into Ant-Man, Hank Pym. This is going to focus pretty specifically on Hank Pym, not any of the other variations on Ant-Man, Giant Man, Goliath, so on and so forth, because there have been a lot of them. Oh, you don't believe me? Well, the Wasp has on occasion, gone kind of by Ant-Man. Scott Lang took over the role when Hank Pym became Yellow Jacket. Clint Barton, better known as Hawkeye, was Goliath for a while. Cassie Lang, that's Scott's daughter, became again a Pym particle hero. So a lot of people have been associated with the various personas that Hank Pym has taken on. And to minimize confusion, I'm just talking about Hank Pym here by and large. Because for those of you who've listened to Mark and I review Ant-Man, some of this might be a bit of a retread. But Hank Pym as a character is a good deal more interesting than 90% of his rogues gallery. I looked it up. It took me a while because apparently his rogues gallery is so thin that most people don't even bother making lists. You can find lists about anything on the internet. It took me a while to find a list of Ant-Man enemies. Hank Pym as Ant-Man, one of the founding members of the Avengers. Originally, it's like him, the Wasp, the Hulk, Thor, and Iron Man, I believe is the and comic. People more familiar with comic history and whatnot can yell at me all they want if I get that wrong. I'm pretty sure that's it. I'm pretty sure that's the lineup. And this is a character that's also been around since the 60s. He was in the some of the Tales to Astonish before it kind of got merged into Marvel Comics. This is a character that's been around a long time, has a lot of history. Somewhere on the neighborhood of it's 2015, 40, 50 years of history have gone into this character. And Pym is he's a very interesting character, and he's a bad guy as often as he's a good guy, it seems. Before I get into him as a character, I do have to touch on kind of the one major, kind of character that because in the Marvel Comics, Ultron is a creation of Hank Pym. Now, they altered that in the cinematic universe because they hadn't introduced Ant-Man yet, and they were going with Scott Lang instead of Hank Pym for a variety of reasons, some of which I'll get into here. And it just... it was a choice I understood, but Pym creates Ultron, and my understanding has always been that this was a bit of an odd choice for him. I'm going to see if I can find, specifically... a lot of I am not a big comic book fan because I don't have the time, I don't have the energy, I don't have the money to really get into it. I try to be aware of these things, but I'm not intimately familiar with this. But Hank is the one who creates Ultron, the robot that, gains sentience and becomes one of the greatest villains that the Avengers ever face in the Marvel Universe, and then Marvel Cinematic Universe really kind of downplayed him and turned him into a backdrop for setting up Civil War and the Infinity War storyline. Thanks a lot for that, you bunch of hacks. You took such a character with such promise, because Ultron's a great character, and you just didn't do anything with him. You did absolutely nothing with him, and it was very sad. It was very sad. For my full thoughts on that, tune in to you can check the review that Mark and I did of Avengers: Age of Ultron. But Hank's creation of Ultron is a very important piece, not just for his character, but it plays a big role in Ultron. Because, again, founding member of the Avengers has created, their greatest enemy. When Hank Pym created Ultron, he did so by more or less scanning his own brain into a computer. And that's something that his character has to deal with on an emotional level a lot. Because, again, this isn't just his creation in the sense that, he made a robot. This robot came from his brain. And he really has to confront frequently the fact that Ultron represents some of his urges, some of his, the internal darkness that he deals with is, physically manifest in the Ultron machine. And that's a really difficult thing for him to deal with, especially given, all the pain, misery, and atrocities that Ultron is responsible for. And him trying to come to grips with, that theoretically somewhere the seeds of all that exist within him as well. But Ultron as a character is, again, a very fascinating character, and one that, again, the Marvel cinematic goons did no justice whatsoever, by and large, when it came to the movie. I mean, they cast James Spader, who was awesome. His performance was very good, but they didn't write the character properly, I felt. They didn't give him a lot of screen time. It was, much as I enjoyed Age of Ultron, and especially some of the deeper meaning and the thought-provoking stuff they tried to put into it, it just didn't work all that well in a lot of ways. And Ultron as a character kind of got the short end of the stick there. And it was really sad because he was the highlight of that movie until Paul Bettany showed up, after which point Paul Bettany became the highlight. But and again, Ultron he's gone through all these variations, all these changes. There's some really interesting stuff with him in that he actually can't harm the Wasp, Janet Van Dyne, Hank Pym's wife, because of Hank's connection and Hank's love for her. He can't hurt her. It's something about how he was, how the brain transfer went. He is unable to cause her harm because of that, and it's a constant source of annoyance for him. But he can't, it takes a while for him to kind of learn to overcome that. But again, Hank as a character is, I need to expand on some of the stuff I talked a little bit about in our movie review for Ant-Man, so I apologize for those of you who are hearing some of this twice. I know why they went with Scott Lang instead of Hank Pym for Ant-Man. Not just because Edgar Wright likes Scott Lang better. Hank Pym is a character that has a lot of baggage, and a lot of damage has been done to Hank Pym as a property over the course of the years. He has some pretty severe, emotional and mental issues. He has suffered from, even though they didn't use the term properly, schizophrenia. What they were actually referencing in those stories was dissociative identity disorder. But that term hadn't been coined yet. There wasn't the same kind of information and knowledge about schizophrenia versus what at the other time. That particular disorder is also known as multiple personality disorder, and there's still a large debate about whether or not it actually exists, which is for mental health professionals to throw back and forth, not for me, a lowly, podcaster, to break down in depth. But again, Hank has suffered from some pretty severe, mental issues. He's very devoted to science, to pure science. He's very driven by that. A lot of his experiments and a lot of his failings have come from that. Again, the creation of Ultron was, by and large, a scientific experiment. He devoted himself to kind of doing that, to creating Ultron and the Ultron program. And he didn't, if I could paraphrase, Jeff Goldblum's, scene-chewing turn from the first Jurassic Park movie, you're so busy wondering whether or not you can do something, you don't stop to think as to whether or not it should actually be done. And they've kind of merged elements of that character with their version of Stark in the movies. But Hank Pym is a character, again, very scientific, very driven by that. Versions of him are very pacifistic, not a big fan of violence, believes firmly in rehabilitating prisoners and attempting to do that. And again, the poor guy, he tries so hard. And he's one of these people who, as a character, sees things very clearly from his perspective. This is how things should be, this works, and then is confused as to why no one else sees them that way, why no one else does them that way, why people are so stupid. And this puts him at odds with, other superheroes from time to time because, they might have different perspectives than he does. and he butts heads with people, and he can't. Again, he has a hard time understanding why people do things differently than how he thinks they should do them, and it creates a lot of inter-character conflict. It creates a lot of interpersonal conflict within him at times, trying to deal with it, trying to understand it. And he suffered mental breakdowns in the past. He frequently will take leaves of absence from the Avengers, in some cases just to focus on research, in other cases because he really, again, just can't handle some of the stresses. And there's a lot of baggage there from a cinematic standpoint. From trying to, if you Google Ant-Man, if you Google Hank Pym as people who see, there are a lot of people who see Marvel movies who are not familiar with the comics, which is, neither here nor there, good nor bad, mind you. But it just, again, so if you want to try and get into it, especially a lot of kids, because the Marvel movies try to appeal to families and children, if you look up Hank Pym, there's some stuff in there about him beating Janet Van Dyne, his wife, and yeah, that's not going to fly, really, in a contemporary society. Excuse me. And so, again, I understand why you can't go with that character, but he's a very interesting character. And, again, the time he strikes his wife, it's portrayed as an accident, as him finally kind of losing emotional control. It's not a chronic thing, but it still happens, and it's still something he has to try and deal with. He has a very loose handle on his emotions, and it's very obvious. He doesn't fly off the handle often, but when he gets frustrated, he goes that way. He has plenty of emotional outbursts. He quits the Avengers a few times because he just can't quite get a handle on everything. For anyone who watched, and a lot of my introduction to the character came courtesy of the animated show Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes, which I believe is still on Netflix and is a great cartoon if you have the time and the inclination. And he just has a really hard time kind of dealing with it. He has personality breaks. The Yellow Jacket personality is a very different personality from Hank Pym. It's the same guy, physically, same human being, but he's very different emotionally. He's very different from a personality standpoint. He's much more cocky. He's much more aggressive. And, kind of an opposite version of Hank Pym in a lot of ways. And it's hard. And again, he just can't handle being, the personality of Hank that is, Ant-Man / Giant Man. So he develops the personality of the Yellow Jacket. And that's it's a very different personality. He develops, when you first meet him, when he first kind of joins the Avengers, he does not have the ability to grow. He has the ability to, communicate with ants and shrink, but he doesn't have the ability to become Giant Man. And he admits that he developed the ability to increase in size specifically because he felt insecure around guys like Iron Man and Thor. And that's, again, that speaks a lot to the character, that he's, again, his emotional standpoint, his emotional fragility. He, again, his powers aren't good enough, so he thinks up a way to improve them, gains the ability to grow. He changes names for, again, the Yellow Jacket is a different personality as well, but he's, and I was slightly annoyed that they went with Yellow Jacket as a suit and as the villain for Ant-Man because, again, it as an aspect of Hank Pym is much more interesting than Corey Stoll playing kind of a slightly more interesting version of Obadiah Stane in the film, but the way they went with things, that's kind of how it had to go. But again, so you lose some of that, but the Yellow Jacket is much more cocky, again, much more aggressive, much more prone to using violence instead of intellect to solve his problems. And again, Hank has many different personalities. He has the Giant Man, personas. He has Giant Man, he has Goliath. He's actually handed over the mantle of Goliath to a few other people. Again, Clint Barton, Hawkeye, very famously became Goliath for a while. And it's just, and again, Hank has been removed from the Avengers a few times because of his irrationality, his behavior, his erraticism. I'm not entirely sure that's the correct word even, but erratic behavior. He was tricked by one of his villains, Egghead, into stealing some things. I forget exactly what, and then Egghead proceeded to let him take the fall for it. He's just as a character, he's had a really rough go, and he's found himself at crossed paths with the Avengers, almost as much as he's found himself on the same side as them. He just, again, from a mental and emotional standpoint, and the last we saw of him, I believe, in strict Marvel continuity, he had somehow fused with Ultron, which was an odd thing. But again, Ultron being his creation. And Ultron as a character has a really interesting undercurrent in his desires, stemming from family. I believe there's a few arcs of his that specifically deal with that. He just kind of views Hank and Janet, so Ant-Man and the Wasp, as his parents, and he just kind of wants to have a family. A few versions of Ultron have had that as their primary motivation instead of just kill everyone. And again, Hank having to deal with that, so he fuses with Ultron, and that's actually kind of a happy merger because the new form lets him kind of ignore and really control the emotional outbursts that he'd had to deal with that had held him back in a lot of ways by becoming, a fair part machine. That winds up kind of falling apart later when emotion is reintroduced into the artificial intelligence, and he winds up leaving the planet, actually, because he has such a hard time reconciling what Ultron has done, what he has done in a very real sense at this point with, who he wants to be and what he tries to be as a person. And that's a hard thing to deal with. That's a really difficult thing. And I think Pym Pym, when he's written well, is a very interesting character, a very, again, compelling character who has baggage, who has emotions, who has inner conflict. And it's a hard, facing down some of, in many ways, the after effects of what he has created. And it's very difficult for him to try and deal with that. And it's hard. If you created the murder bot that is Ultron, that tries to kill you and wants to wipe out humanity, that can be a very difficult thing to deal with from an emotional standpoint. So it's not like I blame the man for having issues, but when you have appropriate writers who are able to handle all of his backstory, all of his baggage correctly, he's a very fascinating character, and again, very intelligent. Not just a founding member of the Avengers, he's one of the Illuminati, which is when it comes to the Marvel comics, the Illuminati is the collection of the greatest and most intelligent minds on the planet. Specifically, I believe it's Tony Stark, Charles Xavier, Black Panther, Hank Pym, and Doctor Strange. There might be one I'm forgetting in there. Banner when he's Banner and not the Hulk. But Mr. Fantastic, my brother corrected me. Thank you. The smartest man on the planet, unless you listen to Victor Von Doom, and Doom reigns supreme. So let's not have that argument. But he's part of that group. He's just got so much. And again, when you're trying to make a movie, when you're trying to introduce a character, going with Hank Pym would have been a big risk and one probably not worth it in the long run, considering how aware we are now of domestic violence. And you can't have, a 14-year-old kid who's never heard of Hank Pym outside of the movie looks him up and stumbles across, him smacking his wife. Trying to spin that as a hero is a very difficult thing. And again, Pym just has too much baggage at this point to really be that kind of character, that kind of hero to the mass audience who's going to look things up and, maybe they don't understand the full backstory of Pym and what has led to some of his issues. And again, to those of us who are aware of them, who look at them, who, to those of you, I say in this case, you who have followed the character for a long time, you understand how he got to where he did. You understand the baggage, the backstory, the context to everything. And bear in mind, I am in no way, shape, form, or fashion trying to excuse, again, incidents of domestic violence or spousal abuse. But, when you see it you have to see it in proper context. And in the case of Hank Pym, the context is extremely important. This is an emotionally unstable human to begin with. When the incident with Janet happens, he's been removed from the Avengers. He's got, his research is not going very well. He's struggling to find his purpose in life. So he's trying to weasel his way back onto the team to create, a false villain for him to come in and stop and re-earn his place. Now, let me say, that is the poor guy must have never seen, any stupid sitcom, any comedic movies, because everyone seems to try that. It's a horrible idea. It never works. It never works. Someone of his intellect should have known that, but he's just an emotionally unstable person, kind of to begin with, hence, the different personalities and all the other issues that have beset the character throughout the years. And that's just strict continuity. That's, for want of a better phrase, main world. If you get into stuff like his Ultimates version, I mean, that character is, a psychopath. that character, again, the Hank Pym in the Ultimates is deeply unbalanced. He's very mentally fragile. He is on medications. He suffers from severe depression. He constantly kind of undercuts the authority of Captain America. He's just, again, not a good person in that version, in the Ultimates, in the Ultimate Universe. And if that's the version you happen to stumble across first, instead of, slightly more depth of character that we get in, the strict continuity, then you're even more of a loss, because how's this guy a hero? And a lot of what Hank Pym, when he's handled correctly, represents is overcoming, some of those issues, trying to cope with mental fragility, emotional imbalance. And, as someone who has some issues along those same lines, you guys don't care, and I'm certainly not going to go into my whole psychopathology here. But, a character who's able to kind of fight and try to overcome those things is an important character. There's just a lot of, baggage and issues and mistakes that go along with, being someone of his power and in his position and having to try and deal with that. And again, with proper storytelling, with, proper writing, the communication between writer and artist and whatnot, it's very compelling. It's very interesting. But if you're trying to appeal to, the masses for a Marvel movie, and let's face it, they try to appeal to the broadest audience possible, and I don't blame them. You can't go that way. You do have to kind of go with Scott Lang. I've scheduled this particular episode to be shorter because, again, I'm just here talking to myself. But I do want to take this moment to bring up a notion that Jesse Starcher kind of shared, because there's an interesting kind of pattern when it comes to Hank. He frequently takes absences or is fired or quits, but there's usually a version of Ant-Man or, someone who is able to, harness Pym particles on any given Avengers team. And a lot of them, there's a fair amount of them actually that kind of start as villains and then are rehabilitated or see the light or whatnot, and kind of mend their ways after somewhat being influenced by Pym or, other people. I mean, Scott Lang, for example, who is the, primary hero in the movie, is a thief. His daughter in the comics, I believe his daughter is very sick. He's at his wit's end trying to figure out how he can afford the treatment she needs. So his response is to steal the Ant-Man costume, which is no mean feat, mind you, but he does it. Then uses it to, commit bank robberies to get enough money. And due to some technological issues, he's not quite able to, because again, he shrinks, breaks into bank vaults, shrinks the money, leaves, but he has a hard time with, getting the money to grow again. In some cases, it just shrinks until it goes away. But after the Avengers kind of catch up with him, they see that he's basically a good person, and he keeps the Ant-Man suit and that kind of responsibility while Hank becomes Yellow Jacket. And, Scott Lang is, rehabilitated that way. He becomes the Ant-Man, shrinking, communicating with ants, growing if necessary. Again, Clint Barton, Hawkeye started as a villain, and he, when he is Goliath, that's part of, I think that kind of plays in. I might have some of the chronology messed up here, so I apologize in advance to those of you who are going to yell at me over this. But, as Goliath, at some points in time, he's a bad guy, but he also, being Goliath kind of helps bring him towards the hero side and helps him, go from, being a kind of the, thief, the vigilante that he was, assassin, depending on, where we are specifically, and lets him, become a good guy again, become a hero. And that's not in any small part, because of what Pym is able to do, because of, being Goliath instead of being Hawkeye. And there's quite a few of them that, there's quite a few characters that Pym kind of, indirectly or directly rehabilitates. It's almost like, being, utilizing his powers, being able to manipulate Pym particles is, the people who have taken up those mantles tend to be guys who are redeemed. They're in the middle of redemption stories, or instead of, guys who tend to, being able to wield Mjolnir or having access to an Iron Man suit or any of the other kind of hero things we have. The Pym particle manipulation is very much for people, trying to walk the straight and narrow, people who have struggled in the past or continue to struggle with doing the right thing all the time and for the right reasons. And it's a really kind of interesting trend that Jesse brought up to me when he was kind of pitching ideas for how to make this more for this podcast. Because again, I looked at this guy's rogues gallery, and Hank Pym has a thin rogues gallery. Most of his enemies are just guys who have tangled with the Avengers on a regular basis, not so much people specific to him. And again, one of the big ones that kind of excludes that is Egghead, who tried a great deal to discredit Pym to prove that he's smarter. He again got Pym locked up and taking the rap for theft, burglary, breaking and entering, things of that nature. He's kind of Pym's nemesis as far as that goes, but he's a very poor nemesis. He's not he's not a terribly interesting villain. He doesn't have powers. He's just an intelligent person, which seems to be a superpower depending on who you're working with, because if you're interacting with stupid people, being a very smart person can be a superpower. And again, Egghead is just kind of his nemesis as far as that goes. And again, it's a weak nemesis. It's another reason they went with Yellow Jacket as an external villain for the movie, because them some pretty slim pickings when it comes to figuring out, and we're making the Ant-Man movie, so who's going to be the villain? Well, pull up the old list, and well, that's a thin list, because we already did Ultron. We already did Ultron. We've already assembled the team, so he can't really interact with Loki. So making Yellow Jacket, it makes the most sense. And again, their version of Pym in the movie is, and I do want to talk about this, is a very interesting version. He's a little bit weighed down by his years of being a hero. And he mentions a few times that, wearing the suit that much took its toll on him, but that's never expanded upon. And I call that poor writing. But when that script was rewritten as many times, when there's, at least 3 different cooks in the kitchen at any given time, you're going to get bad soup, or at the very least uneven soup. And that's what we have with the movie in many ways. Though, again, full review, you can find it in the archives. I'll go ahead and pimp that right now. But he's very weary. He's also, he had to deal with the loss of his wife. They do not use Janet Van Dyne as the Wasp. They let their daughter Hope is going to be that character, and why they went with Evangeline Lilly, I'll never know. She's just not an engaging actress. She's a very kind of cold, standoffish. There's nothing to draw you in there. And again, odd choice, especially when you consider that the Wasp is, in the better story, is very much the emotional kind of heart of the team, very much the average, the everyday person. She just has fun being a superhero. And when you're surrounded by people who, Stark with his, genius and arrogance, Banner with his curse, Cap with, his baggage, and when you're surrounded by borderline tragic characters, someone who just has fun being a superhero is a very different, kind of character. And I'm not quite sure what direction they're going to take their version of Hope in, and I think it'll wind up being very interesting. But again, I'm not quite sure how they're going to go with it. But their version of Hank is, again, very protective because he's dealing with the loss of his wife, which is something that the character in the comics has to do as well. Janet died. Again, comics, no one actually dies except for Uncle Ben. And just as a shot to my good friend Benjamin Cologne, I have to wonder how many more years we're going to get with Joe Quesada before he decides it's a good idea to revive Uncle Ben in some way. And he might. Yeah. Anyway, anyone familiar with Joe Quesada's tenure kind of heading the direction of Spider-Man and subsequently wishes to kick him repeatedly in the balls, we'll get that joke. Joe Quesada is responsible for the worst ever Spider-Man storyline, just flat out worst ever. He has metaphorically kicked many Spider-Man fans in the balls more than once, and I think they all would like to repay the favor. And I just wonder if he doesn't think that maybe reviving Uncle Ben in some way is not a good idea. And that's, again, but that would be then, because he's the only character that stayed dead. Everyone else that you thought had stayed dead, seems, Jason Todd came back, Bucky Barnes came back, Jean Grey has come back multiple times, but Uncle Ben just stays dead. Again, until Quesada decides it'll be a good idea to force that down everyone's throat, and that'll just be awesome. But anyway, he's dealing with the loss of his wife. He's dealt with that in the past. Actually, when she died in the comics, he took up the mantle of the Wasp in her honor. but he's very much, again, he's a genius, especially in the kind of the field of biochemistry, which is how he discovers the particles, the formula that he uses. But he's, again, we have a very kind of world-weary version of Hank Pym in the movie, one who has already been a hero. He already spent his time as a hero and is now stuck with all the baggage that comes with having been a hero for so long. Because that's not easy. That's not an easy gig. And again, it's a very interesting one. He gets a few good lines in. He insults Scott Lang's crew, which they deserve it. I think he gets my favorite line of the entire movie, actually. And if you've seen it, you'll understand that I'm now going to be referencing various things as it's not a keychain. I don't want to spoil that gag for anyone who hasn't seen the movie, but it's pretty funny. And again, I really kind of hope, and I don't know if we're getting an Ant-Man sequel in the near future. I mean, we're not in the near future because Marvel has, laid out their plans for the next 4 or 5 years. And an Ant-Man sequel has not yet been announced. If they do, Michael Douglas going full-blown mad scientist trying to find his wife in the quantum zone, or the quantum universe, which is where you wind up if you shrink too far. Actually, technically speaking, if you shrunk too much, you'd turn into a black hole because you just gain infinite density, at which point you have infinite gravity and ta-da, singularity. At least as far as I'm aware, though. Any physicists, astrophysicists in particular, listening to this who would like to correct me on that, feel free to throw things at my head if you should see me. Or you can follow us on Blog Talk, you can subscribe, iTunes, Stitcher, you can you can like us on Facebook, and you can throw things verbally at my head at that, from those locations if you'd prefer that way. But again, they've done enough of the science that they don't shrink they shrink, but the distance between atoms is not affected as such to increase density to an exponential level. So that's, kind of their excuse for getting around physics as we understand it. But again, him going full-blown mad scientist would be very interesting, and especially Michael Douglas is a very talented actor, and he could pull off going crazy. So something to kind of keep your eye on, especially as he delves back into the science of it. But that's again, when I decided I was going to do this, it was to kind of synergize with the rest of the week here on the Rad Legend Broadcasting Network, and it just. Once I actually looked up, how much material I had to work with when talking about Ant-Man and Hank Pym, I just kind of went, I really wish I'd looked this up sooner so I had more time to figure out if I really wanted to do this, to pad it out. But again, it's been an odd week for me. I just, again, nothing's quite working. Nothing's quite clicking and firing the way it should. So my apologies as far as that goes again. But again, Hank is just, again, a very fascinating character. A very interesting villain. I mean, if he goes bad in an Ant-Man sequel or in, any of the crossovers, maybe, he'd be very interesting, to see how he plays as a villain. Again, if he, suffers from a personality shift, or if he breaks because he can't figure out how to find his wife from the quantum universe now that Scott Lang has returned from it. And there's a lot of ways to go with Hank to kind of make him a villain if you want for a sequel. And again, I wouldn't be opposed to that. The character in source material, he's got, again, there's darkness, there's baggage, there's a lot of stuff to draw on if you need inspiration to try and make him, the focal villain of a movie. And they did a great job of establishing Scott Lang as a likable protagonist. So him having to kind of go against a man who has much more experience with the suit and is a great deal more intelligent than he is would create an interesting dynamic, I think. So to anyone out there from Marvel or the unpaid intern who will report to a slightly paid intern who will, and so on up the food chain, there's my idea for an Ant-Man sequel, if you happen to be listening. Although they still have to get him to grow. He can only shrink thus far in the movies, and he needs to be able to grow, once they get that sorted out. But I think part of the reason they don't have him grow is because the idea might be, well, if he can grow, then shrinking is stupid. And as untrue as that is, it's a mentality a lot of people might have when viewing the movie. So they've got to get that sorted out so he can, grow in it as well as shrink. All right, I believe that's going to wrap me up here. So again, Hank Pym as a character, very interesting. I wish they would have been able to do more with him in the movie. And if they make him go bad, he'll make a great villain, assuming he's written correctly, which is kind of a stretch for some of these Marvel movies to be written correctly. But when they are, they're very good. So something to look forward to there. Or we might get a version of Egghead. You know, you never quite know. He might, if they want to bring Ultron back, Hank Pym recreating him would not be out of the realm of possibility. Just another thought. And hopefully, if they bring Ultron back, he won't suck. They'll be able to, handle him properly. All right. That is going to wrap me up here, though. So thank you also very much for being here. Thank you for tuning in. Again, for the Radulich Broadcasting Network, you can subscribe here on Blog Talk Radio, iTunes, Stitcher. Follow us, rate us. You can leave comments, critiques. We appreciate all of that. We do look at it. So thank you for that. You can like us on Facebook. That's probably the best way to get updates. That gets updated pretty regularly. Plus, there were links. Our lead page on the Radulich Broadcasting Network Facebook page is a bunch of quick links to all of the past shows. So if you don't want to go digging through the archives, the last couple of months or so are up there for easy access. And again, that's probably the best way to keep in touch and keep up to date with everything that's going on here. Plus, that's where we kind of debut the art that Benjamin J. Colon does, and you should follow us just for that. I'm not going to lie about that. Just for his artwork for The Long Road to Ruin. Totally worth it. All right, so again, follow us all there. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening again. Follow again all the great shows we have. We have something pretty much every day of the week. We're pretty consistent here, and we thank you all for listening. Thank you for following along. I will be back next week. I'm not sure with what. There's a few different options that are if I want to synergize with the rest of the network. I'll see if inspiration strikes me. I'm hoping to, get my feet under me again, mentally, emotionally, physically, from an energy standpoint. So I'll be back full speed next week. Thank you all again for being here. I've said that many times because I mean it every single time. Thank you guys. You listening makes all the difference in the world. Thank you. Tell a friend, please. Share us on Facebook, Twitter, however you happen to, interact with your world. If you know people who you think might like some of our shows, tell them. Tell the world we're trying to grow this thing here. We would like to, grow the brand. Maybe turn this into something that can actually make money instead of just being a hobby for all of us. We put a lot of work in, and so again, share us. Thank you. We appreciate all of that. All right, that's wrapping me up. I will see you guys next week. For those of you who are fans of MMA, every Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I host the 411 Ground and Pound radio show. That's where I'll be soon. We will be this week reviewing UFC on Fox 16, Dillashaw versus Barao 2, and we will be previewing UFC 190, Rousey versus Correia, who's really just a Brazilian pig hostage because it's Ronda Rousey. I mean, come on. I shouldn't have to explain that one. All right. Speaking of UFC on Fox 16, I will have coverage this Saturday over at 411 Mania, so stop by, say hello. It's going to be, I really hope I'm wrong about this. I got a feeling it's going to be a long night. So, again, stop by, say hello. I will very much appreciate that. Yeah. All right. And for the last time, that's wrapping me up. Thank you all for being here. I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, I don't really have anything Ant-Man related, so I'll just use kind of my fallback when it comes to that. You can't really appreciate, a good hero without a great. You need contrast. You need the opposing force. You need someone to push your hero. If you don't have that, you've got a very bland character. All right. And as always, here on the Radulich Broadcasting Network, please be well, be safe, and behave. I'll see you all next week.
So say good night to the bad guy.